Welcome to This Explainer. If you flip on the news or just scroll through your feed lately, you'll constantly see this stark visual contrast. On one hand, you have endless, booming Chinese megafactories churning out advanced tech, and on the other, established American military might and global naval fleets. It creates this overwhelming sense in the media that an imminent changing of the guard is happening right now. Well, today, we're going to dive straight into the heart of that tension and unpack a very specific, and honestly, a pretty surprising thesis drawn directly from academic and geopolitical sources, why China is actually not a superpower.
Now, right out of the gate, we've got to be absolutely clear about something. We have to acknowledge China's undeniable historic achievements. In just a few decades, they've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That is a feat literally unparalleled in modern history. Today, they completely dominate the global electric vehicle market, they're an absolute powerhouse in renewable energy, and their manufacturing base is just extraordinary. But all of that leads us to ask a really massive question. Does all of this economic and industrial success actually mean they are already the world's predominant superpower?
Well, to answer that objectively, we really need to look at how international relations scholars actually define the term. David Lampton, the director of China Studies highlighted by Cornell, hits the nail on the head. He notes that their aspiration is to become a comprehensive global power, but superpower is just not the right way to think about it. The crucial point here is that being a true superpower requires a completely balanced portfolio. It's not just about having a massive economy. It requires simultaneous global reach in military, cultural, and diplomatic power, rather than just regional dominance.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for evaluating this objectively today. First, we'll look at the superpower checklist. Second, demographics and debt. Third, the soft power deficit. Fourth, the military projection gap. And finally, a multipolar future.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the superpower checklist.
So to evaluate China impartially, without getting caught up in the daily political noise or the media hype, we have to look at what actually constitutes a Cold War-style superpower. Drawing from our sources at Cornell and the Air University, a state has to project power across all of these dimensions globally. It needs global economic might, worldwide military projection, authentic cultural influence, and political leadership. Now, China undoubtedly ticks the economic box, for sure, but checking off the rest of these on a truly global scale, that's where it gets incredibly complicated.
Which brings us to Section 2, demographics and debt.
International relations scholars, like Daniel Dresner, point out that China's rapid rise took place during the sort of Goldilocks moment of absolutely perfect domestic and international conditions. But those conditions, they're shifting fast. Just take this number for a second, 300%. While China's central government debt is relatively moderate, when you factor in the massive deficits of provincial and local governments, the total debt-to-GDP ratio hovers around the staggering 300% mark. A lot of this is tied to local government financing vehicles that were used to endlessly fund infrastructure and stimulate growth. It's become so massive that Chinese officials have actually referred to this local debt themselves as a gray rhino, essentially a highly obvious but largely ignored threat that could completely derail their economic stability.
And compounding that debt issue is a rapidly ticking demographic time bomb. World Bank data shows that China's working-age population share has actually been declining for over a decade now. Driven by the legacy of the one-child policy and plunging birth rates, China is now officially an aged society. That demographic window that fueled their massive manufacturing boom, it's closed. This aging population threatens long-term productivity, it shifts government spending heavily toward healthcare and pensions, and ultimately, it puts a major damper on domestic economic growth.
Let's move on to Section 3, the soft power deficit. So, while hard power is all about military and economic might, soft power is about cultural diplomacy. The term was coined by political scientist Joseph Nye, and it's basically the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. It utilizes a nation's culture, its political values, and its foreign policy. The thing is, true soft power relies heavily on organic cultural appeal bubbling up from civil society. It really can't just be manufactured from the top down through state-directed propaganda.
And this dynamic creates a massive challenge for Beijing, especially in places like Southeast Asia. Despite deploying a huge economic footprint through Belt and Road infrastructure all across the globe, that financial weight doesn't just automatically buy political trust or public goodwill. In fact, surveys show deep skepticism regarding China's strategic motives in the exact same regions where they are investing the absolute most.
The reason for this trust gap becomes pretty stark when you compare China's approach to nations like the US or Japan. China's cultural exports are heavily state-centric. They're driven by government policies like the Belt and Road or state-funded Confucius Institutes. But American or Japanese soft power, that's organic. It's driven by civil society and the private sector. Think Hollywood, anime, or global tech platforms. Because China's cultural outreach is so tightly controlled by the state, it's very often viewed with suspicion, and it really struggles to gain credibility in liberal democracies. As experts note, China's cultural diplomacy is less of a grassroots effort and more of a calculated extension of its foreign policy. The crucial takeaway here is that you can heavily fund global media outreach and language centers all you want, but without independent civil society participation, you just can't authentically win hearts and minds on the world stage. Put simply, you can build a port, but you really can't force cultural admiration.
All right, let's look at Section 4, the military projection gap.
We constantly hear in the news about China's new ships and their massive domestic military buildup. But global superpower status demands worldwide projection, and when we contrast these two militaries, the gap is literally eye-opening. The U.S. boasts a global logistics network with bases in over 80 countries, 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carrier groups that can sail for years without refueling, and decades of battle-hardened modern combat experience. Meanwhile, China currently operates exactly one official overseas military base, located in Djibouti. Their naval fleet, while definitely large in sheer numbers, consists heavily of green water vessels with limited unrefueled range. Plus, their military hasn't actually fought a full-scale war since 1979. Because of this massive logistical and experiential gap, Chinese military doctrine relies on an asymmetric strategy. Their focus is heavily on regional anti-access and area denial, or A2/AD. Essentially, they're building thousands of missiles and defensive systems specifically designed to defend their immediate periphery and deter adversaries from entering their local waters. They just aren't structured right now to deploy, supply, and sustain massive military forces across the entire globe like a traditional superpower.
Now, here's what's really interesting. This assessment isn't just some Western bias. Prominent Chinese scholars like Xu Ruke and Sun Degang actively admit this reality. As they bluntly put it, China is an economic heavyweight, but a military featherweight and will remain so for the coming decades. The logistical gap with the United States remains vast, and it is incredibly difficult to close overnight.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, a multipolar future.
Having looked at the massive debt, the soft power deficit, and these real military constraints, we kind of have to ask a fundamental question. Is China's goal even to replace the U.S. as a singular, unipolar global police force? Historical sources actually suggest a very different set of priorities for Beijing. Their focus has historically always been on internal statecraft, domestic consolidation, border security, and defending what they consider core territories. Even their massive Belt and Road initiative is much more about securing economic supply chains than it is about embarking on overseas colonization or global regime change.
Because here is the undeniable truth. Being a global superpower is outrageously expensive. The United States has spent roughly $19 trillion on its military just since the end of the Cold War alone. For China, engaging in a direct, symmetric global arms race to achieve that level of worldwide projection, it would drain critical resources right away from domestic development and at the exact moment they're facing severe demographic and economic headwinds.
So, let's pull all of this source material together. The reality decodes the dramatic headlines we see every day. China is an absolute economic and technological titan, for sure, and a hugely vital player on the world stage. But, according to the strict academic criteria of a Cold War-style superpower, they simply lack the balanced global portfolio, an organic soft power and worldwide military projection required to claim that singular title. Which leaves us with a really provocative final thought. Maybe our entire Western checklist for a superpower doesn't even apply to China's actual vision for the 21st century. Does China even want the incredibly costly and burdensome job of being the world's sole police force? Or are they simply aiming to build a multipolar world, securing their own sphere of influence in a system where no single nation rules? It's a question that completely reshapes how we understand the future of global politics. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this helps you navigate those daily headlines with just a bit more clarity.